We continue our discussion now of philosophy and leisure with examining Aristotle's notion of leisure from the Nicomachean Ethics. And so if we go back to Aristotle here, looking at leisure, one of the problems, I think, with understanding the nature of philosophy itself and what we do in philosophy and its relationship to our other aspirations and goods in human life is that we don't understand our own leisure very well. That's because of the way that I think we tend to use our leisure. And so Aristotle has some very insightful things to say about this in Book 10, Chapter 6, the Nicomachean Ethics. And so Aristotle here is talking about happiness in general, and he says, he thinks about what would be happiness and what wouldn't. And he says, first he talks about he talks in Book 10, Chapter 6 about the pleasures of playing. So here he says, well, actually, let me start just before that. He talks about activities chosen for their own sake. That's part of what happiness is. He says, and those activities are chosen for their own sake, from which nothing is sought beyond the being at work. And actions in accord with virtue seem to be of this sort, since performing actions that are beautiful and serious is something chosen for its own sake. And so, but then someone might object that, oh, there's all sorts of things that we do just for their own sake and not for anything else, and that's like when we're playing. And so I think one of these fundamental problems is understanding leisure as primarily as play. So this is what Descartes says. He says that play seems to be this way. But he says, well, people seem to be harmed by the fact that they play more, but not always. Many of those who are considered happy escape into pastimes of this sort, and for this reason, people who are charming in such ways of passing time are highly regarded around tyrants, for they display themselves to the latter as pleasing in those things which they aim at. And the people tyrants need are of that sort. So in other words, we tend as people to enjoy the people who are playing, that amuse us. It seems then that these pastimes are conducive to happiness because those who are in power spend their leisure in them. Right? So he says that the people that are powerful, and we look at the rich and the powerful people in our world, and we look at how they spend their time, what appears to us is they tend to spend their time playing, doing the kinds of things, perhaps playing video games, watching sports, drinking heavily, doing all sorts of things that we wish we could do, and we're jealous because we want to be able to play as much as them. But then Descartes challenges us into the fact that perhaps rich and powerful people spend their time this way. He says, but perhaps such people are no indication, since virtue does not consist in having power, nor does intelligence, and the activities that are of serious worth come from these. Right? So he says that just because you're powerful doesn't mean that you have virtue, doesn't mean you have intelligence. If we're going to really figure out what we should seek and do in life, we should seek not just the rich and the powerful's opinion, but the virtuous people's opinion. And if those people run off to bodily pleasures because they have no taste for pleasure that is pure and suited to people who are free, one ought not to believe on that account that those pleasures are more worthy of choice. Right? So he says that these people, rich and powerful, aren't necessarily capable of enjoying the best pleasures. And we talked about this previously, but that you need to become a virtuous, intelligent person in order to enjoy what pleasures are actually worth enjoying throughout the course of your life. Even children believe that things valued by themselves are the best things. So it is reasonable that just as different things appear worthwhile to children and to men, so too do different things appear worthwhile to the people of a low sort and of decent people. As has been said repeatedly, the things that are worthwhile and pleasant to a person of serious moral stature are the ones that are so. To each person, the way of being worked that results from his own active condition is the most choice-worthy. Right? And so, in the end, happiness, the best kind of life is not going to be a life of play. Though, interestingly, Aristotle does say it's a life of leisure. Aristotle's going to say that leisure is necessary for happiness. That our happiness consists of being able to have and use leisure appropriately. So in this sense, it's interesting that technology, in some sense, does absolutely serve our happiness insofar as it serves, first, our ability to survive, right? So tech serves survival. Can't write. And our leisure. And insofar as it serves both of those things, it keeps us alive, and it makes it possible for us to enjoy leisure. But then that still raises the question, how do we enjoy our leisure? And that's not an unimportant philosophical question or human question. as Aristotle just criticized for us, our leisure is in being necessary for happiness. Our leisure does not consist in play alone, right? If we understood play, and we understood amusement, we see that in many ways the playing and the amusements that we have really are preparation for work again. They're ways of resting, of getting ready to do work. But there's a more fundamental sense of leisure that isn't playing and resting and preparing for work. It's by looking at a kind of fundamental activity that transcends work. And so what we need to do is, and if we're going to mention leisure here, we need to try to better understand what is the nature of work, right? And so now we're going to turn to our essay here by Josef Pieper. Josef Pieper had a series of lectures on the nature of philosophy. So we're looking at the first lecture here, and this idea, what does it mean to philosophize, right? And we'll sort of walk through this article. And Josef Pieper, in raising this question, immediately starts to help us understand the nature of philosophy in terms of this relationship between leisure and work. Josef Pieper gives us a definition of philosophy from the start, where he says, if you see right here on page 29, philosophy is an act in which the world of work is transcended. Right? That the nature of philosophy is an act in which the world of work is transcended. Now, here's this interesting thing that let's write this: philosophy is an act in which the world of work is transcended. In some senses, this is an extremely broad definition of how we understand philosophy. It's going to connect us fundamentally with this idea of leisure, because, in other words, he's saying that philosophy, in some sense, fundamentally the most leisurely of activities. It is the archetype for leisure, as being something that's distinguished from work. Well, what is work? He talks about work in terms of serving the kind of common utility. In this sense, we could say that work serves our survival, right? Persistence, right? As people, it's work. The reason that we work is that we work in order to help us survive, to help us fulfill those needs that we have as human beings, to continue to persist in our lives. And so work is fundamentally oriented to things that need to get done in order for us to continue, right? Leisure is not understood like that. Leisure is not done in order to survive. Leisure is what we survive for, right? So here's this fascinating, I think, kind of distinction, that we work to survive, right? But we never ask, what do we survive for, right? We work to live, to survive, and so then we raise the question, what do we live for? What is it that we're actually seeking to live for? And that's where this notion, I think, of leisure comes in, that if we look at our work that we do and how we live our lives, we tend to have some type of meaningful activity, meaningful leisure, which becomes the part of the reason that we do everything else. When I go to work and I do the thing that I have to do to keep my family alive, then when I finally get to come home, I get to do some of my leisure, and I get to enjoy what I truly want to do. And that doing what I want to do is this very notion of leisure. And so the real question is, what are the kinds of things that most transcend work, that are most what serves us? And so it's interesting if we look at philosophy in relationship to these things. Josef Pieper, when he understands this question of the nature of leisure and the nature of philosophy, he connects philosophy then with all sorts of important leisure activities. If we look here on page 32, right? Josef Pieper says that if we need to truly understand philosophy, we need to see it as analogous to all sorts of other works that step beyond this world of work, that step beyond just doing things purely because they're going to keep us alive. And he talks about several. He talks about poetry, right? He says excellent poetry is where we transcend life. We transcend our striving just to survive. Right? We could write poetry about trying to stay alive, but the poetry itself is beyond that. He says prayer is like that. He talks about love and being in love and loving another. Even he talks about the notion of suffering. Suffering itself, and what he calls a kind of profound existential shock, which is accompanied by us living in the world, and then looking at our proximity to death. So he says, those such shocks, the philosophical act, authentic poetry, experience of the fine arts in general, even prayer, are all based on a shock. Man experiences the inclusiveness of this world of everyday concerns. Man experiences the inconclusiveness of this world of everyday concerns. He transcends it. He takes a step beyond it. And so we understand this human activity as human activity in seeking our happiness through leisure is connected to our desire for poetry, for prayer, for love, to deal with our own proximity to death. These are the kind of things that we spend our life loving. Now, Pieper doesn't mention this, but it's music. Things that are the flower of our human lives become the true sources of leisure here, right? And so, really, what are those kinds of activities that we most can enjoy for their own sake? Pieper suggests all these kinds of things, but he says that philosophy, in some sense, sort of typifies them, right? Philosophy typifies all these leisure activities that are most worthy of being done outside of life. If we jump ahead, here on page 37, we then see Pieper talking about this very notion of freedom and how our desire for freedom is related to leisure, right? And so when we talk about being free, and we talked about this in class, we talk about freedom as, again, being able to do what we want. We're trying to be able to do what we want in our lives. But what we see here in Pieper is that, and we've discussed early in this course, that what we want isn't always what we want, and so we need to see what is the most free use of our freedom, right? It's interesting that the very notion of freedom connects clearly to philosophy. That philosophy, as he says right here in the bottom of 37, that philosophy, however, has always been understood to be the freest of all the free arts, right? It's in the sense it's least capable and least ordered towards a particular use. Now, whenever you try to use philosophy for a purpose, we'll talk about that as being a kind of ideology. We'll come back to that. But he says, in and of itself, true philosophy cannot be used, right? This liberality, however, implies that philosophical knowledge does not receive its legitimation from its usefulness and its applicability, or from its social function, from its reducibility to a common use, right? If we think about excellent music, excellent art, excellent poetry, it's not legitimized by the fact that it's able to be used for a commercial. It's legitimized because it is excellent in itself, and philosophy is like that. And it's the one least capable in and of itself to be ordered towards other human uses. It's interesting that Pieper connects this to the idea of academic freedom. He says, academic freedom is lost in precisely the same measure in which the philosophical character of academic studies is lost, or alternately expressed, to precisely the same degree in which the totalitarian claim of the world of work conquers the space of the university. Okay? If we go down on the bottom of page 38, Pieper writes, the government of a country might very well decide that it now needs, in order to implement its 5-year plan, physicists who can make up for the lead that foreigners have had in this or that field. That it needs physicians through their scientific research that can develop a more effective treatment for influenza. It is possible to speak and dispose over things in this fashion without contravening the essence of the specialized sciences. So there's nothing that's inherently opposed to physics to say we need to find and support physicists who are going to be able to make advances in this area of physics. And there's nothing contrary to medicine to say, you know what, we need to find and support physicians who will support this arena of serving human health. But what if, Pieper asked this question, what if that relates to philosophy? But if the same government were to say, we now need philosophers to, well then, in that case, there's only one possibility: develop, justify, and defend the following ideology. But in speaking this way, we simultaneously, if we look here, we simultaneously destroy the possibility of philosophy, right? That philosophy, in its essence, is truly this free raising of the most important questions of life, right? And our art, what I would argue, is our art, our music, all of these things, all of these leisure activities that we ultimately find meaningful, right? Meaningful leisure activities like art, music, right? Prayer it fits in some ways a whole different category, but it fits within this too. Even our prayer life and all these types of things really are meaningful because they help us in some sense address what is good, true, and beautiful in human life, in the world. I wish my handwriting was beautiful. That the best music, the best art, and all these things are meaningful as in relationship to our desire to understand what is good, what is true, and what is beautiful in this world. And that's essentially the questions of philosophy. That philosophy, in some sense, addresses this head-on. Philosophy doesn't just address it musically and poetically, but it raises these fundamental questions that we can rationally consider. That we can it is fundamentally connected to all these, but it's philosophy is raising these questions that matter the most for our human existence, right? And so it's interesting that in raising these questions, well, these kinds of questions in our understanding of philosophy relate to sort of our understanding of nature in general. That up to this point in time, that with modern philosophy, thinking of nature as the arena, or once again the raw material for human activity. If we try to understand nature that way, we then raise this question of if that's all that nature is, what's worthy of wondering about? What's worthy of seeing that's good in that? Is the only thing that's good what we do? Right? Is the only thing good human activity and what we can create, or is there something inherently good as well? And so, connected, this Pieper suggests, is this kind of this more theoretical turn towards things. He says that is the purely receptive in its beholding, without any hint of desire to change things, but rather with a willingness to let the affirmation or deny of its will depend on the knowledge of the essence through which the reality of being is brought to language. Only if being in the world mean more to him than simply the arena, the stuff, the raw material of human activity. That we'll only truly get this true understanding of leisure and of philosophy if we understand, according to Pieper, that the world is not just this arena of human activity, that we are within the world, and that there is a good, true, and beautiful that transcends us, and that true, good, and beautiful that transcends us gives meaning to our art and our music and our philosophy. They become the basis which compel us to philosophize, to not just be satisfied with playing in games, but to be satisfied only in a life which addresses the life's most compelling